Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this short presentation that we've been asked to do in school by Vanessa Phillips, who leads in school on reading. She's one of our assistant principals. My name's Chris Roberts. I'm the Additional Needs and Inclusion Manager. The way we're going to structure tonight's meeting is that I'm perfectly comfortable if people want to open their microphones and ask questions. That's absolutely fine if that's what you feel you'd like to do. I do have Mrs. Sargent kind of co-hosting with me, and she'll run things on the chat. So people should now just be able to come and go as they please. Please use the opportunity if you do have questions to put them in the chat, or if you're feeling brave and confident, please open your microphones and give any contributions that you feel would be useful or anything you'd like to know more about. I'm going to go to a screen share in a moment and share our presentation. Please be aware that this is the last presentation in the series of reading presentations that have been done by school. So there are other ones that are accessible, and Mrs. Stewart will send out information about those. So there are key stage specific ones, and there was also a presentation that was put, or that will be put online and was done last night by myself and Mrs. Davis, and that was around engaging reluctant readers through early years in Key Stage 1. So if your child's just moved into Key Stage 2, you might find some things in that that are relevant as well. So I'll put the screen share on now, and hopefully technology will work okay for us. Just take that back to the beginning. So thanks to everyone for joining us. As I said, we have done other presentations earlier in the week and through last week as well. And when Mrs. Sargent and I planned this one, we tried our very best as much as possible to say, well, let's try and stay away from ground that's already been covered in previous presentations and try and introduce some newer ideas or newer bits onto this. So our aims for today, we're going to examine why some children will have barriers to becoming an enthusiastic reader. And then hopefully we'll share some suggestions for engaging children in reading. I think most people over the last year have probably spent more time on these kind of Zoom Teams meetings than they might normally like, and probably have had lots of training and that sort of thing delivered through that. So I think when you leave training, whether it be online or whether it be in person, I think you would just want some practical suggestions for what you can do. So hopefully we'll come up with those. There's a couple of things just to cover first though, and essentially it's around why reading is important. Now, I'm sure that really we're preaching to the converted on this. You'll have joined this Zoom because you'll know the power of reading, you'll know how important reading is, and obviously you've probably got some concerns that your child may be becoming a reluctant reader or is a reluctant reader. So just to have a quick look at these, I think it's really important. I'll not go through it at length, but to just recognize, the power of reading. I think there's an interesting stat down here around how reading reduces stress. So obviously it's got some physical benefits there as well. I think it's really important to note that whilst it's looking at reducing stress, it reduces it by more than 300%. Going for a walk, obviously important for our young people to point out, it's 600% better than playing a video game in reducing stress as well. I do note that they decided to go with drinking a cup of tea rather than drinking a glass of wine when they were looking at 100% there. Maybe that would have changed that slightly, but essentially we know that reading's very positive for lots of different reasons. And if we can get our young people, students, to engage in reading, these are the sorts of outcomes that we will see. So we'll see really positive outcomes if they read for 20 minutes a day. So reading for 20 minutes a day gives you access to over 1.5 million words a year. If you only read for a minute in a day, you only access about 8,000 words per year. And the pyramid here shows that students who do this over a long period of time, they'll score very positively on standardized tests, and students who don't do it will score much less positively. Obviously, we're not just looking at standardized tests, but they're an important factor, and obviously it gives us a bit of a barometer for how successful things will be for our students going forward. So one of the things we've not spent, or we're not going to spend much time on this evening, because I think it's been covered in the other presentations, is really around kind of building a reading culture, which is something we've talked about a lot in school. Obviously, it's something we'd encourage you to do at home as well. But I think this kind of graphic that I saw on social media sums this up really nicely. Essentially, what we're looking for is that parents are really good role models in reading. And the reason this graphic I think is really important is because it really opened it up to me to say, actually, as much as I pride myself on reading as often as I can to my children, I don't think they ever really see me read for pleasure. They'll see me on my phone regularly, but they won't see me read for pleasure. So all these sorts of things here are just kind of gentle reminders. So the reasons some children are going to be reluctant readers, I think you probably have a fair idea yourself if you have a young person in your house who is a reluctant reader, but obviously it may just not be one of their interests. Sport may take over. That may be around time. It may be around the energy they can put into it. It may be around not having the ability to concentrate after being really tired. It may be that they find reading or decoding really challenging, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. Essentially, decoding the English language is really difficult because of the broad base of where the language has come from and the different places the words have come from. You can teach children rules for reading, but then sometimes you have to backtrack and you'll very often find words that don't fit those rules, and the rules don't always apply. So it is challenging learning to decode text, and that's something we need to be mindful of. Obviously, other things get in their way in their lives, computer games, their friends, and sometimes they can just relate it to homework as well. And that's obviously what we're trying to stay away from. We're trying to kind of build a love of reading as much as we can, and building enthusiastic readers through that love of reading. So one of the things to consider really is around how text is presented. To get this slide for the PowerPoint, all I did was type the letter A as a lowercase and as a capital into Microsoft Word, and then I just scroll down the font selection, and you'll see that A or A, depending on how you're saying it, can be presented in so many different ways, and even just something as simple as this can be a real challenge for some students. They see things presented in a different way at different times, so giving consistency can be really important, and you'll notice that hopefully more. And as you go through, if you look at even supermarket shelves, it's rare that a font is consistently delivered. So how text is presented to children is really important. Often in schools we'll try and use that as we would want them to write it, and that's why quite often in schools you see Comic Sans as a text on the walls and as a text on worksheets and in books, because that best presents how we would like our students to write it. One of the really important things for reading, and these symbols really gives an idea that children do this from an early age. They tend to do it automatically. The automaticity of reading is really important. So you'll probably know yourselves, if you're driving down the motorway, children can read this or recognize this symbol and interpret it from a long way away. They'll know a McDonald's sign, they'll know the golden arches and the M. They'll probably pick up a Cadbury's packet as well, and they'll know Cadbury's, even though that's in a very strange font. They'll be able to read that because they know it. They'll know the Xbox symbol, Alton Towers, and all these sorts of things that get marketed to them and they see regularly and they see often. They have an automaticity with it, and that's around overlearning, seeing it regularly, being engaged with it. So that's what we want to try and do with our text as well. Children who read efficiently and effectively have an automaticity of recall and recognition of words. So that's what we want to try and build up. And sometimes overlearning and repetition is the only way to do that. So the kind of thing that you might see that just kind of backs up how challenging reading would be, we see this in schools quite often, is that you can take a sound as simple as there, and it can be represented in so many different ways. And as you go down through these, you can see obviously all these consonant sounds here that we have, all presented in text in slightly different ways. And these are the things that children have to do. And this doesn't cover all. Often if you have this on your wall in the classroom as a teacher, you'll find loads and loads of words that don't fit into these rules. So as complicated as this may seem, you end up with lots and lots of different ones that are different. So we've framed that reading can be challenging. We've framed why we may have reluctant readers, and really what we want is to give you some practical things that you can do. So even just taking the word read as it is, if you say I read every day, change the context of it and you say the same thing a bit again further down, you say I read to the class yesterday, all of a sudden that word read should have been read. I read to the class yesterday. That was all context dependent, and that word just tricked us based on the context, and there was no clue reading up to that in the sentence or leading up to that in the sentence. So how to support a reluctant reader is something that we're hoping we can provide you with some practical strategies with. So we would hope that lots of these you'll have already tried, and we would hope that, I think looking at this, there's about 14 on there. It may only be that you pick up a couple of ideas from this and you've tried the rest, but I think even if you just come away with one or two, if it's more than that, that's great, but some ideas where you can go, actually, I'll try that. We haven't tried that one, or we only tried that once and it didn't work. Let's try it in a different way. That's really the aim of tonight, to give as many practical strategies to support as we possibly can. So the first one essentially is to just not be afraid of technology. Sometimes I think it can feel a little bit like, particularly where we've talked earlier in the slide about, children accessing technology too much and that not linking to reading. Well, the two don't have to be mutually exclusive. You can have things that support reading through technology. So there's loads of really good websites out there. There's loads of really good apps. We've just picked a few that school have used and that we know are effective, that other parents have recommended to us as well. Obviously, you would look to be doing things that engage your children specifically, but there's loads of really good things with technology that can support reading. So you're a better parent than I am if you've never had to give your child an iPad or an iPhone or something technological to keep them quiet for a while, whether you're in a restaurant or a shop, or you just need a break from their delightful little voices for a little while. We've all been there where we have to give them something in terms of technology. If you structure that to be something educational, then you can still have a bit of a win that way as well. So reading aloud with and to your child. The facts, I think, are on here, and I think these have been on all the presentations done by school, because I think it's really important to recognise this. I think as a society, we accept that we read to children who are younger, and we do that really well. And I think what tends to happen is for various different reasons that drifts off and it declines over time. So looking at those facts down the side there, it's rare that children are read to consistently by the time they're looking to reach kind of the top of Key Stage 2 and into Key Stage 3. So we would encourage you to keep going with that. Obviously, you're going to change the text that you were reading with them. You may change the way that you read with them, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go through. But reading aloud with your child is really, really important. And we'll cover that a little bit more as we go through the slides. Obviously, parents will quite often look at bedtimes and stories at bedtime, and that's a fantastic routine to be in, and is definitely part of the reading culture and building a reading culture that will have come up in the other presentations. See, sometimes you may have more than one child, and you try to put them both to bed, so audiobooks are a really good alternative for this. If you want to keep them separate, allow one of your children to read an audiobook, you can read with the other one, or a couple of them listening to audiobooks together. Long car journeys, all those sorts of things are really, really fantastic opportunities to introduce audiobooks. And there's loads and loads of different ways you can access them, and it's really positive. I think one of the really great things about audiobooks as well is that it removes that stress of decoding that we talked about. If a child is finding decoding of text to be challenging, obviously you're giving them access to a high level of literature without them having to do that. And you're doing that as well through reading to them or reading with them. So asking your child questions or encouraging them to ask questions is really important when you read as well. So one of my favorite pictures on this presentation as we looked at it was this one here, and it's essentially this child who's opened up a book, and the kind of a world of possibilities is opened up for them through opening that book. But also what it's delivering is that for children and for all of us, if we can build pictures in our mind as we're reading, we will become good readers. And a good book, if you're an effective reader, will do that for you. But sometimes we need to teach children that explicitly, and we need to support them with doing that. There are ways we can do that as we go through the presentation that I'll mention more, but I think it's really important to notice that as something that's going to be really effective. And one of the ways to do that is to, you might call it interrogate a text or ask questions of a text. So the introduction to Charlotte's Web is there. Where's Papa going with the axe? Said Fern to her mother as they were setting the table for breakfast. If you just look at that sentence, you could have a really long discussion with a child about that. And all of that discussion would be really around building their understanding or getting them to ask questions, and that would get them to put pictures in their mind. So anytime you do that with your child, you discuss things, you ask questions of the text, ask them to understand things about the text as well, then that's really going to build them into effective readers who've got a positive mindset towards it as well. So there are loads of different ways you can do this, but if you watch a film and then read the book, or some stories have become films and then become books, so it can be the other way around as well. But doing this can build loads and loads of skills and hopefully build some enthusiasm for children as well. It also gives you the opportunity to develop some key skills across the curriculum. Comparing and contrasting things across the curriculum is really, really important. But anytime that you're going to open up the chance to have a story where the children have already got those pictures in their head that we've just talked about, that's going to be really effective for them. So if they've watched Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, they've already got an idea of what Hagrid looks like, so that when he comes through in the story, they have that in their head and they can focus their attention on other parts of it. Obviously, as you develop this, you'll notice things in books that are missing, some things in films that are missing, depending on which way around the story has been produced, and all of those things give you opportunities to discuss with your child, have a chat with them, and develop their love of reading through that. If they've got a film that they really enjoy and you know they know the words to it, if you put the subtitles on, it's amazing how often your eyes are drawn to subtitles. If you've ever watched a film that's in a foreign language, your eyes just automatically get drawn to subtitles. Pausing films as you go through them, if they know the words already, or the words have just been said by the character and they appear on the subtitles, you can almost do a bit of trickery where children have or begin to develop that automaticity because they know the words that are there and they're just identifying them as they go through. So watching films with subtitles on gives really, really positive way for children to access text. It's really important when you're looking for things to read or for your children to read, to follow their interests and following their authors as well. So I know I probably read this book here on the top left-hand corner, Diggers and Cranes, probably about 100 times to my son. It was his favourite book when he was really 2 and 3 years old, and it was the one he always went for every night. So I just have read that cover to cover probably about 100 times, and many people feel the same about lots of different books as well, whether that be the Gruffalo or any of the other books that you know your child absolutely loves, then it'll feel that way. But actually that was his interest. It's something he's still interested in. He still loves all those sorts of things, so you can move that on. It's a slightly more advanced book. It keeps his interests and making sure that those interests are kind of followed through, and he's supported to keep going with that. Obviously interests develop over time as well. Books, we're looking at obviously fiction books, there's non-fiction books, and all those sorts of things. Whatever it is that interests your child, then that's great for them to read. I know at the minute my son's moved on slightly from Diggers and Cranes, and he really likes Dr. Seuss, and unfortunately the books that he has of that are really, really small, and the text in it is small. It's quite often on a dark background. And I know certainly when I get in late at night and he's asking me to read to him, I find that really challenging. And that's around kind of my tiredness. And it's difficult text to read if you've ever read Dr. Seuss, because it's essentially a whole list of tongue twisters. But as much as I internally groan when he pulls out 3 Dr. Seuss books to read before he goes to bed, I know that it's something that's what's going to engage him, and that's what's going to keep him having that love of reading. So I drag myself through it to do it. And there may be lots of other things that interest them, and just a wide variety of interests. You know, you can nearly always find a book or some literature to go alongside it. If you are looking to just embed decoding, or working on embedding decoding with your child, so their ability to access the text, rather than looking at what we've talked about previously, where we're trying to get their sort of understanding, their comprehension, maybe inference and deduction and those higher level skills. If you're just looking for them to embed their decoding and access the text independently, then really make sure that, particularly if you're doing things kind of later at night, that you're giving them accessible texts. So there's quite a few series of books that do this. One of the ones we use in school are this one, which is kind of called the Talisman series, and the Totem series of books as well. So they're kind of most of the words in there are quite phonetically plausible and easy to sound out, and each book kind of concentrates on a slightly different sound. So there's quite a lot of repetition in how the sound comes through in each of the stories. Project X does something very similar as well. So they've got quite a kind of low threshold for being able to access them, but the interest level in them is a little bit higher, so easier to read, but also trying to engage on a higher interest level as well. So there's lots and lots of different series of books that are out there that do that, and that's something that's really important, because you're essentially trying to remove the challenges that the students are facing. One of the things that kind of happens through school is that we're developing Talk for Writing. So Talk for Writing, whilst it is mainly based on improving writing, certainly looks at, concentrates heavily on improving reading as well. And a Talk for Writing text is essentially a text that children learn, and they learn the kind of tips and tricks and sentence structures that make good different genres of writing, so that they have that internally and they know it. And essentially they know it in the same way that someone would know a song that they love. They know it through repetition, they know it through hearing it, they know it through repeating it. And all of that repetition is exactly the same way we know song lyrics. So whilst you may not want to have a karaoke night at home, that's perfectly possible, and that's also another good way of getting reading in there. But the text that they're going to be reading can be learned through songs. For younger students, that's exactly how they kind of learn nursery rhymes. One of the books that we've got at home, we got sent from one of our friends in America, and it's essentially just the lyrics to Take Me Home Country Roads by John Denver. And my children think they can read that book, even though they can't, because they got a little bit obsessed with it. And they got a little bit obsessed with the CD that was included and the song that went to it. So they actually learnt most of the lyrics just by singing it. What you'll find often with this is, you'll find that you can challenge them to find their mistakes or their misconceptions as well. So this little graphic here gives us we built this city on sausage rolls, which of course is not Starship, the Starship lyric. But again, it's a way that they can learn, and they can start to have a bit of support and a bit of structure, that they actually know lots of the words to things already, and they're just choosing the words as they come along, and it supports them that way. Shadow read is a term that was actually coined this afternoon by Mrs. Sargent and I when we were discussing this, because we talked about supportive strategies that parents could use. When we were looking at this presentation, we don't even know really whether or what the correct technical term for this is, but essentially this would be what we would say, just read a book at the same time as your child. So not read it with them, but just make an agreement. Well, tonight we're going to read chapter 1, and I'll read it before I go to bed, but long before that happens, they'll have read it. It obviously just gives you the dialogue, it gives you a narrative to have with them, and it encourages you to just talk about the books as well. So shadow reading, we might copyright that, but essentially it's just something where you have another way of saying, well, if your child is kind of entering Key Stage 3 and they don't want to read with you, or they don't want you to read to them, they don't want to read to you, it's an agreement that you could make to say, well, if we don't want to do that, let's agree that tonight we'll read chapter 1. I've left these books on here, and these are really Key Stage 3 leading into Key Stage 4 books as well. But I think it's something that some parents have commented on when they have done this in the past, or this kind of thing where they've tried to support their children at home, is that they've actually realized how difficult some texts can be. And as our students particularly get into GCSE, they're accessing really, really difficult texts, and they're texts that adults will find difficult to read. So you can start to understand why your child is facing some challenges around that. And obviously, if you're reading it at the same time, you can support them with it. You have that dialogue, and that will work really effectively, because it's okay to say to a child, actually, you know, look, this is a really difficult book to read. I'm finding this difficult. And you can build a bit of resilience that way, a bit through a bit of empathy. I'm going to flick back there for Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and this is a graphic novel. And essentially what happens is, as books get longer and longer, we kind of lose that picture element to it. And it's important to note how much some students are supported by that. We've talked about building pictures in your head, having a movie in your head as you read. And that's really, really important. And graphic novels allow you to do that. So if you look at those two things side by side there, it's not exactly the same part of the story, but it is the same story. It's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And if you are a reluctant reader and you look at the text on the left-hand side compared to the images on the right-hand side, you know, it's pretty obvious and clear which one would be more attractive, or which one you would probably read more enthusiastically. So graphic novels are really, really important. And if you've got someone who's a reluctant reader, you know, it would be great to access them. And it's just another supportive measure that you can have. Aside from the schoolwork, then, to just encourage reading, I think reading for a purpose. This quite often comes up with writing a lot as well. If someone's a reluctant writer, you know, finding a reason for them to write is really important, but reading for a purpose is just as important. So these are just some examples, and if you start thinking it through, you'll probably be able to come up with lots of your own. The kinds of things you can be doing is, obviously, we've got a Netflix screen grab here. Essentially, it's a series on Netflix. It's got the kind of introduction to each episode. You know, so if this is something your child's interested in, you know, the vast majority of TV shows have a little introduction. Get them to read the introduction before they watch the TV show. Or if they're going to choose an episode, get them to decide between which two of the episodes they might watch based on what this introduction says, which one's going to interest them more. Again, we've talked about computers and tablets and phones, but actually, you know, reading for a purpose. Again, social media here, you may obviously want to really closely monitor what your children are accessing on social media. But, you know, if your child was into wrestling, they may like Triple H, and they might like to see what he's tweeting, and all those sorts of things. Again, are just reading. It's reading for a purpose, and it's reading that they'll hopefully do enthusiastically. If you're planning a day trip out somewhere, you know, there'll be every possibility to look at a couple of reviews of different places that you might go to. You know, ask your child to get on TripAdvisor, read those reviews, see what they think. There's a reason for them to do that reading. Compare between a couple of different options, and then even get them to justify why they've chosen what they've chosen. Obviously, takeaway menus have got loads of text on them, lots of pictures, offers. There's a bit of maths thrown in there as well about what could be the best deal. But essentially, again, it's reading for a reason, reading for a purpose. Instructions into games, again, that's quite a long text there. But if they're going to play a game, if they're going to access something like that, then get them to read the instructions and do that with them. So I think when we're looking at reading, if you feel your child is becoming a reluctant reader or has become a reluctant reader, I think it's really important to consider what you're asking them to do and when you're asking them to do it. It's really, really nice to have a reading culture where you read last thing at night. But if your child is finding decoding difficult or is not enjoying reading, then asking them to read last thing at night may not be the best thing to do. It may be that it's better doing it on a Saturday afternoon, and all those sorts of things are things that you just have to play with and try different things. But definitely there's a strong argument to be made to say sometimes it'll just be around a kind of cognitive drain that they might be feeling. They've just done too much, they've accessed lots anyway, and then you're asking them to do more on top of that as well. That could be really challenging for them. So consider the time of day and which day of the week you're doing these things as well. So from our point of view, that kind of concludes the presentation. I think the last thing really to think about before we just do a last slide that has got some recommendations on for websites that you could access is to just remember to stay really positive. I think anytime you're trying to kind of modify a behavior or a behavior pattern, it can become a little bit frustrating. And I say a little bit, but I know it can become very frustrating. And essentially when you're doing that with young people, you know, you've got sticks and you've got carrots, and that's what you've got to try and modify behavior. You know, you can encourage them with carrots, or you can try and beat them, metaphorically, of course, with sticks. And generally, if not always, it feels better for all parties to use the carrot. And sometimes because we're tired ourselves and we can find a level of frustration ourselves, you know, we forget that. But essentially our young people are young people, and if you go into your workplace and your boss is constantly kind of telling you that you're not doing your job effectively, you're going to kind of end up with a negative feeling about that, and you're likely to have a negative reaction to that as well. So we want to, just as much as we can, stay positive. Any kind of reward system that you might maybe call bribery, anything like that that you can do to kind of keep a level of positivity around reading is really, really important, because reluctance will come through a kind of feeling of negativity or a feeling of failure or not being able to do it. So that's really the kind of last message on that, is to stay positive. So I'll leave the couple of websites that are recommended, some through school and then other ones through our department that we know. And from my point of view, that really kind of concludes our presentation. So we'd just like to say, you know, a massive thank you to people for logging on tonight. Really big thank you from school's point of view for everything that you do to support our students and your children. You know, it's having that open dialogue and that collaborative working between home and school is always a really positive way to secure good outcomes for children. So we really appreciate how engaged our parents are, and we really appreciate everything you do to work alongside school, and hopefully you'll continue to do that in the future so that we have a really positive reading culture in school. So thank you and have a nice evening.